Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Baltic Breakfast, organized by Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. Today's topic is very timely from many perspectives. It's about coast and climate. And it's not timely only because we talk about climate in the media today. I mean, we have the IPCC report recently, the upcoming COP26 meeting, but it's also timely because we have the World Water Week. And today is actually the Baltic Sea Day, an international day to sort of emphasize the Baltic Sea issues, organized by the John Nurminen Foundation in Finland. So therefore it's very nice that we organize this Baltic Breakfast together with Helsinki University. So welcome again. My name is Gun Rudqvist and I work as Head of Policy at the Stockholm University Baltic Sea Center. And we are the organizers. And I will not dwell upon the Baltic Sea Center. I think you've heard this many times before, but just to highlight the fact that we are, of course, a research unit, but also working a lot with policy and communication and running Askö, the field station. And as I said, this is a joint collaboration together with Helsinki University. And there is a new joint collaboration that we are recently started that is called the Baltic Bridge. And its focus is actually climate. So that collaboration between Helsinki University and Stockholm University will go deeper into ecosystems functions in relation to climate. So this breakfast is part of this Baltic Bridge collaboration. So today's topic, coast and climate. You can all dig deeper into this topic by reading our new policy brief. Healthy coastal ecosystems are crucial to mitigate climate change. And it's also, of course, available on our web, and it'll be appearing also in Swedish a bit later on, but now it's in English. As always on our breakfast, please give us questions. Take your chances to actually pose a lot of questions to our or at Slido. And I think you will, in the presentations at the bottom, there'll be the addresses. And the Slido code is 22102, 22102. And we'll, as always, do our best to answer these questions and get back also with information on the web with questions popping up. So today's topic, the coast. The transition zone between the sea and sort of the terrestrial areas, they are really biodiversity and productivity hotspots. And they play and can play a significant role in oceanic carbon cycles. So today we will learn more about how this works and the situation for the different ecosystems and the functions and threats, etc. And we have two speakers with us. And first, Camilla Gustafsson, who is a university researcher from the University of Helsinki and with a PhD in marine biology. And Camilla will start and guide us through the functions of coastal ecosystems and focusing on carbon dioxide. And thereafter, Florian Roth, who has a PhD in marine science and is doing a postdoc combined here at Stockholm University and Tvärminne Zoological Station at Helsinki University, will continue and talk more about healthy versus degraded ecosystems and with a lot of focus on methane. So thereafter we will of course have a possibility to talk together and answer questions. So let's dig right in and I will give the floor to you, Camilla. Please, welcome.
Thank you, Gun. I'll share my screen. Right. So thank you, everybody. Good morning. So I'm going to talk about blue carbon and blue carbon ecosystems. Oops. Okay, so first of all, what is blue carbon? So it's a concept that describes carbon that is captured from the atmosphere and stored by the oceans and coastal ecosystems, particularly by vegetated coastal ecosystems, such as seagrass meadows, coastal marshes and saline meadows, mangrove forests, and macroalgal belts, including different kinds of kelps and seaweeds. And this concept highlights that coastal ecosystems, in addition to terrestrial forests that are coined green carbon, that these blue carbon ecosystems also contribute significantly to carbon sequestration. And these ecosystems extract or capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it in the seafloor, for example, through trapping of leaves, roots, rhizome material, but also different kinds of carbon-containing particles from the water column that then eventually accumulate on the seafloor. And this carbon uptake can result in both short-term storage in plant and algal biomass, but more importantly, to a long-term sequestration within the seafloor. And through continuous sedimentation, this organic material may be buried in the sediments where it can remain for millennia. And this is then coined a carbon sink. Here in the figure, we can see intact coastal vegetation. We have mangroves on the left, salt marshes in the middle, and seagrasses on the right. And here, the purple arrows depict photosynthesis, where the plants take up carbon dioxide. It gets sequestered long-term into woody biomass and in the soils, here shown in the red dashed arrows, but also respired back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, here shown as the black arrows. A recent study by Bertram et al. Offers a global economic assessment of carbon sequestration and storage in certain blue carbon ecosystems, namely, in this case, mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. And they estimate that, that these blue carbon ecosystems contribute on average with $190 billion per year to blue carbon wealth, which is the value of carbon stored in these ecosystems. Here we can see a picture of a seagrass meadow here in the Baltic Sea. This is a coastal meadow along the Danish shore of the North Sea, mangroves in Australia, and then bladderwrack beds here in the Baltic Sea. And from this map, we can see the global distribution of different kinds of blue carbon ecosystems. We have kelps and other seaweeds in green, and they are namely distributed from polar to tropical regions. We have mangroves in black, and they're only found in subtropical and tropical areas. Salt marshes in blue, and they're mainly found in polar and temperate regions. And then seagrasses in yellow, which are similarly to the kelps and other seaweeds found from polar to tropical regions. And in this graph, we can see the average long-term rates of carbon sequestration in grams carbon per square meter per year in different kinds of soils, in both terrestrial forests, but also in sediments of coastal vegetation. And what is the most important observation from this graph is the substantially larger carbon burial rates in the blue carbon ecosystems compared to their terrestrial counterparts. But notice though that kelps and other seaweeds are not included in this graph. So even though kelp and other macroalgae have recently been classified as blue carbon ecosystems, they have long been overlooked. And this is probably due to the fact that they grow on hard substrate. So they don't necessarily sequester carbon in the same habitat where they live, but through the transport of this macroalgal or detritus out to the sea, and finally to the deep sea, where it then gets sequestered. And through the shredding of old fronds and other biomass, kelps and other seaweeds support a continuous flux of export material. And this detached macroalgal tissue is transported offshore by currents, and then it finally starts to sink, and then it reaches the seafloor where it gets buried, and the carbon is then sequestered there. Algae also release dissolved organic carbon, which constitutes then another pathway of macroalgal export of carbon. because some of this dissolved organic carbon also gets exported to the deeper layers of the sea and then finally reaches the seafloor where it can be sequestered. And the blue carbon ecosystems in the Baltic Sea include seagrass meadows that contain different kinds of freshwater and marine species. We have macroalgal belts, however, no big kelps, but these other kinds of seaweeds that are smaller. But we also have coastal meadows that contain different kinds of grasses, sedges and rushes, and then of course reed beds. And obviously we don't have any mangroves here, unfortunately. And in this map, we can see the distribution of seagrass meadows in the Baltic Sea area. And it's estimated that the seagrasses cover a minimum total area of 1,200 square kilometers. But this estimation actually only includes seagrass meadows with a marine seagrass species, eelgrass, Zostera marina. But especially here in the more brackish parts of the Baltic Sea, we often have shallow bays and lagoons that have abundant vegetation that consists of other rooted plants of freshwater origin. And we currently don't really know how these plant communities contribute to the blue carbon. The macroalgal belts consist of 3 different kinds of brown seaweed species, of which bladderwrack in the middle here, Fucus vesiculosus, is the most common one. And they are commonly found on hard substrates. But bladderwrack actually also has a loose-lying form that is found on soft substrates in sheltered bays and lagoons where it coexists with rooted plants. The coastal saline meadows that have actually declined over their whole distributional range over the past 50 years, mainly due to the lack of cattle grazing. And many of these coastal meadows have successively turned into reed beds. But reed beds might also be valuable carbon sinks, but we don't have any large-scale estimates yet. And in the archipelago areas or along the Finnish and Swedish coasts, we have variability in different kinds of factors. We can have a very strong variability in substrates or in wave exposure or in salinity. And this permits large variation in different habitats over small spatial scales. This means that we tend to have a quite high habitat diversity within small areas. We might have coexisting seagrass beds, macroalgal beds, and reed beds all co-occurring together over small areas. And we know that this biodiversity, but also environmental context, modifies both carbon and nutrient cycling. And in this picture, you can see Tvärminne Zoological Station at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland. And in this photo, we have both hard and soft bottom substrate that alternate. And we have, for example, seagrass meadows, macroalgal beds, and reed beds all coexisting in the vicinity of the station. So this kind of habitat diversity then enables the study of how different forms of biodiversity can be linked to carbon and carbon cycling. But so from a Baltic Sea perspective, then why are these ecosystems so important for carbon cycling? Well, first of all, they all primary produce, which means that they take up inorganic carbon and transform it to organic carbon in their tissues, and then, for example, release some of this organic carbon as dissolved organic carbon. They also respire, which means that they release inorganic carbon as carbon dioxide. They are all biodiversity hotspots. They are very important habitats for a range of different kinds of invertebrates, fish, microscopic algae, macroscopic algae, and of course, reed beds are also very important for different kinds of birds. And all these organisms together also play a role in nutrient and carbon cycling. They all produce organic matter, leaves, roots, rhizome material that contain carbon and is then buried in the sediments where it can stay for longer periods of time. And they trap organic material from the water, And once these particles are trapped, they get deposited in the sediment, where they also then get buried. And they also act as nutrient sinks for other nutrients, such as nitrogen and phosphorus. But in addition to these processes and functions that relate to carbon cycling, they also provide us with additional services, ecosystem services, such as food security, because they sustain commercially important fish species. They provide us with natural protection against storms. They stabilize the seafloor, protect against erosion. They also affect the water quality, because coastal vegetation and salt marshes can, for example, filter water and take up nutrients, which enhances the water quality and improves the water clarity, for example. They also affect ocean acidification, because coastal vegetation can locally alleviate low pH conditions. And they also affect recreation and tourism, because healthy coasts provide attractive settings for different kinds of outdoor activities. But there are some knowns and unknowns. We do know that these ecosystems maintain important ecosystem functions that relate to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And in addition, they sustain us with different kinds of ecosystem services that benefit us. But there are many unknowns. For example, how do these ecosystems function as sinks over time and space? Or how does the biodiversity in these ecosystems contribute to carbon cycling? So to conclude, the Baltic Sea contains many important blue carbon ecosystems, but our understanding of how other ecosystems that haven't perhaps been traditionally labeled blue carbon ecosystems, such as coastal lagoons with freshwater plant species, we don't really know how these kinds of ecosystems contribute to blue carbon. We also need to explore the links between coastal biodiversity and carbon cycling in more detail, and also the implications of climate change on the functioning of these ecosystems remains veiled. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Camilla. Very interesting indeed. Let me just follow up with two detailed more questions. You highlighted the fact that there is a lot of unknown, and you also said, for instance, as an example, the kelp has not been studied thoroughly and estimated its role in blue carbon. So that means I would presume that the potential to actually function as a blue carbon sort of positive thing for climate could even be larger than what you're actually stressing, right?
Yes, that might be possible. We just don't have enough information as of yet how they contribute. Do they act as sinks, or do they act as sources, or do they act as sinks some time of the year, or sources another time of the year, and how they contribute to the, for example, greenhouse gas emissions that Florian will talk about more. But we need more research.
Yeah, but would you say that at least the potential is sort of acknowledged when it comes to both research areas and also policy areas?
Yes, I definitely think so. That we know that they might work very well as sinks, but we just don't know. We don't have the exact numbers.
Okay, so at least there is a recognition. And you also stressed the fact that there are so many additional benefits of coastal ecosystems. So, from, the layman's perspective, you think that there are so many pluses, but you can't really hear this in the policy discussion. Is this really well thought of, that all these pluses needs to be taken care of?
I definitely think it should be stressed more, because even though if they wouldn't be very, very efficient carbon sinks, for example, there are so many pluses anyways that we definitely need to see to it that we can conserve and keep these ecosystems healthy, because there are so many benefits that we don't potentially even think about, like water quality or just having a healthy coast where you want to swim in the water instead of having massive algal blooms, for example.
Right. And then just a final short one. You mentioned when you showed the picture of the meadows, sort of the coastal meadows, the importance of grazing animals. We hear about grazing animals in relation to biodiversity, etc., but very seldom in relation to blue carbon. Is this a new, or is it just being not talked about?
There are some research projects that have kicked off with where they look at the effect of grazing and versus non-grazed meadows and reed beds, and how that affects different kinds of fluxes of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. So I guess we'll know more when their results come out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's really an interesting aspect when you think about cows and climate. You know, here's a small plus at least, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Camilla. We'll come back to more questions later, and we will move on. Florian Roth, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Gun. So in this presentation, I would like to shift the topic a little bit and move towards coastal greenhouse gas emissions and how they are linked to blue carbon. So studying the emissions of carbon dioxide and methane have become really a major research focus in various scientific fields in the past years. And the two gases are the two most important climate-relevant carbon-based gases in our atmosphere. And the recent IPCC report has summarized really nicely why having a look at them is so important. It's because every ton of CO2 and methane adds to global warming. And while we heard quite a bit about carbon dioxide from Camilla already, I would like to focus a little bit more on methane in this presentation. And the main reason for this is that the strength of these two gases, expressed as a global warming potential over a 100-year time horizon, is very different. In fact, so each ton of methane has a global warming potential of 28 tons of carbon dioxide. So it is really much, much stronger. The second reason why there's increasing research interest is that the concentrations of both gases in the atmosphere have been increasing steadily over the past decades. And that obviously has direct impacts on our climate. Now, surely one would think that most of the emissions come from, for example, heavy industry or agriculture. But in fact, a substantial part of methane emissions originate from natural ecosystem sources, and we are often not aware of that. In the most recent study, Rosentreter and her colleagues even found out that almost 50% of all methane emissions actually come from various aquatic ecosystem sources. Now, that includes rivers, lakes, aquaculture, but obviously also the ocean. And if we have a closer look at the emissions of methane from the ocean, we further have to realize that most of the methane actually comes from shallow coastal areas and sheltered very areas close to shore. Now that brings us actually back to the Baltic Sea and what we have heard from Camilla this morning, where we have so many shallow and sheltered coastal areas like here in the Finnish or the Swedish archipelagos. But it also seems that this would kind of contradict what we have learned from Camilla, that coastal ecosystems in the Baltic Sea can be so efficient in capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and therefore act as a carbon sink. But in fact, microbial processes and the sediments of these habitats can cause substantial methane production. So it is not really contradicting the blue carbon concept. Rather, methane emissions need to be part of the calculation. They have the potential to offset some of this blue carbon barrier. And in the following, I would like to make a short example how that works. Here we have a typical coastal setting in the Baltic Sea. And we're looking at a habitat that is dominated by the macroalgae Fucus vesiculosus. And what we're doing now is making a so-called net greenhouse gas balance. So it's the balance between carbon uptake and carbon emissions from these habitats. And the numbers in the graphs really don't matter right now. If you're interested in them, please feel free to reach out to me or ask me later. But what I want you to focus on are the directions of the fluxes and the differences. So indeed, these algal habitats take up quite a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So we have a negative flux here from the atmosphere into the water column. But we were also able to measure emissions of methane from these habitats. So they are much, much smaller, as you can see. And the flux is from the water into the atmosphere. Now, we have to remember that methane has a 28 times higher global warming potential than CO2. And when considering this fact, the emissions of methane suddenly become quite substantial. They are now expressed as what we call carbon dioxide equivalents of methane. And in that case, if we account for this, the net greenhouse gas balance is actually reduced by 43%. And that is really important to know and understand. And actually, it is often not accounted for in many blue carbon assessments. But we also know that coastal methane emissions are extremely variable in space and time. For example, in measurements from last year, we could see that they differ significantly across typical Baltic Sea coastal habitats, like these reed belts, macroalgae, or sediments, although all of them were sources of methane throughout the year. They are also highly variable over the different seasons, with most methane emissions we're seeing in summer and almost no methane coming out from these habitats in winter. But they're also extremely variable over the course of a day. Most importantly, however, the emissions of methane change when the habitat structure changes, as the production of methane mostly depends on the types of plants or algae, the bacterial communities, and the sediment characteristics. And in general, we can say that in a healthy and undisturbed system with a good habitat structure, methane emissions are quite low. However, if we add stressors to coastal environments like pollution through nutrients or toxins, coastal construction, or other bottom disturbing activities, we lose important plant and algal species, and the methane emissions tend to increase. And in a recent global study, it was basically confirmed exactly this, that in general, impacted aquatic ecosystems release more methane than natural or healthy ecosystems. And to make things a little bit more complicated, coastal methane emissions, or greenhouse gas emission in general, are also influenced by global stressors, for example, warming. So in general, methane emissions from aquatic environments are higher with warmer temperatures. And this is mainly due to microbial activity and other microbial processes. And while this here is only a schematic representation taken from a large global study, data from measurements in the Stockholm archipelago from the last year basically confirm exactly this pattern. So we observed more methane in coastal waters when the temperatures were higher. Now, our colleague Norman Gobler from Tvärminne Zoological Station found that over 70% of the last year of 2020 was considered a marine heat wave at Stockholm, which is just north of Stockholm. So we have to suspect that in this period, where it was much warmer than the general trend in the Baltic Sea, that we had increased methane emissions during these periods. And the team around Christoph Humboldt could already show that methane emissions increase really to record high values with heat waves that occur in summer here in the Baltic Sea. And to make things even a little bit more complicated, this all ends up in an accelerating feedback loop, which is between the climate, between habitat degradation and the carbon cycle. So we heard that habitat degradation may cause an increase in these greenhouse gas emissions. We also know that the increased amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere causes warming. And in turn, we know that warming has also negative impacts on many coastal ecosystems with a change in the habitat structure. So that sounds quite grim, and it feels like there's almost no solution. But there are still some good news. And as we heard, first of all, many coastal ecosystems we suspect are still net sinks of carbon and are actually in a good state. But we need to be aware of the possible drastic changes that could occur. And while working against climate change is obviously almost always the most desirable solution, acting on a local scale can help quite a lot, because reducing local stressors really helps ecosystem also cope with global stressors. So we can basically help nature do its own restoration by promoting healthy coastal ecosystems, for example, by reducing pollution, especially in shallow areas and bays, where it has a very strong direct effect on the plant and algae species. We have to prohibit bottom disturbing activities like dredging or fishing activities, especially in coastal regions. And we also have to further limit coastal development. But also active restoration projects can really help. If you do that in important blue carbon ecosystems, like in this picture here in a seagrass meadow, it really helps that these systems store more carbon than they release. But there are also quite substantial knowledge gaps. First of all, like Camilla said, we have a limited knowledge of the blue carbon capacity in the Baltic Sea region in general. But we actually know even less of the counteracting greenhouse gas emissions. And that is mainly because they are so variable in space and time. And they interact strongly with anthropogenic stressors like local stressors or global warming. So in summary, but it should also be a working hypothesis for us for the future, we can say that healthy coastal ecosystems with well-structured habitats are quite efficient in taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, these systems are very sensitive to anthropogenic perturbations, and a change in these systems often leads to an increased release in climate-relevant greenhouse gases like methane. So with that, thank you for your attention. Please feel free to ask any question now or reach out to me via email. Follow us on Twitter. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Florian. Very interesting. The picture you're drawing is what, as you said, first grim, but then filled with hope, I would say, at the end. And if I understand you correctly, it is difficult at this point in time to say whether or not the Baltic Sea, as it is, sort of functions as a carbon sink or not, you know, giving methane and all that, and this situation of the ecosystems. Is that correct? Did I understand you correctly?
Yes, we don't know right now whether the Baltic Sea coastal habitats are efficient sinks or whether they may be sources. It's really a great question, and I would love to be able to answer it in one sentence, but unfortunately at this point, we don't know the answer yet. Yeah. But it seems like that they are still sinks of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Methane emissions have the potential to offset this, especially because the Baltic Sea is already quite influenced by human stressors. We have this long history of nutrient pollution, which increases methane emissions. So we have to suspect that the offset of methane on the carbon balance in the Baltic Sea may be higher than in other ecosystems or other coastal habitats around the world.
Okay. But it seems that you can be sure, I mean, combined with what you and Camilla both talked about, the importance of functioning ecosystems.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So there is no really doubt there.
No, there is no doubt. Healthy ecosystems, first of all, really help store carbon. That is what we heard from Camilla. But we also know about all these other ecosystem services these ecosystems have or habitats have. And that is why these are many reasons why we need to protect them more.
Yes. So please, Camilla, join us here. And you said something, Florian, that I think also, I mean, you more or less said, Camilla, reduce local stresses help cope with global stresses. So then again, you are, both of you, emphasizing the importance of healthy blue ecosystems, or coastal ecosystems in this case, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So are we doing enough? Is this highlighted enough? Are we taking good care of them in general?
I would say no, we don't do enough right now. Coastal ecosystems are often overlooked. If we compare it with a local forest, if you walk in the forest and you see rubbish and trash there, you right away feel like you should do something or this should be reported. In the coastal sea, hardly anyone sees what is happening underwater, and if the habitats look fine or not, hardly anyone realizes except the researchers that may go diving there. So it's really a matter of awareness, I would say. Awareness for decision makers, for politicians, but also awareness in the public, how to assess whether our coasts look fine or not. that is really difficult right now, and that should be definitely promoted in the future.
Yeah, Camilla,
Yes.
you highlighted
Yeah.
the economic importance as well of these ecosystems.
Yes, so we get so many services from them that we don't necessarily always think about, like fisheries and clear waters and nutrient sinks that then of course also affect what nutrients are in the water column, which in turn then affect primary production in the water column of plankton and cyanobacteria, for example. So there are many additional benefits that then of course have an economic value. But I wanted to add to Florian's the fact that for many people, they don't go diving, they don't go snorkeling, they don't see what's underneath the surface, whereas it's so easy to go out in the forest and see changes. So this is definitely, I want to also stress that awareness is very important in general to increase it amongst the general, but also among policymakers.
But I mean, we all want to go swimming or maybe go sort of fishing for our amusement, etc. And that is also dependent, of course, on functioning ecosystems. So it's not very close from many of us, at least. We have just a few questions so far, but let's take a sort of more science-oriented ones. The question is the contribution of microbial autotrophs, for instance, microphytobenthos, for blue carbon quantified? How does it compare relatively to aquatic macrophytes? This is a detailed question, but is it possible to answer, or shall we get back on this?
To my knowledge, it hasn't been on large scale estimates, there wouldn't be any available yet, but this is something that we would probably target within our new research center, where we are focusing on linking different kinds of biodiversity aspects. So not only seagrasses and plants, but also algae and in fauna and microbes potentially, and microphytobenthos, two different parts of the carbon cycling process. So this is where that could easily be included, or easily, I don't know, but it could be included.
Yes, yes. Just for the audience, please don't hesitate to reach out to Florian and Camilla afterwards, by email or so. This is more like a comment in relation to what we talked about grazing in meadows. If there are any studies ongoing, especially around the Gulf of Bothnia, since around there are, large areas with these kinds of meadows. Are you aware of any studies?
I'm not sure, but I think there are studies going on. I know that there are some that are along the Baltic Sea coast from Denmark through Sweden to Finland, but the south coast archipelago sea region. But I would suspect there would be studies also done in the Gulf of Bothnia, yes.
Okay. And we have a question for Florian here regarding whether or not methane oxidation is less enhanced by temperature than methanogenesis.
Yes, I think the answer is yes. So we measured extensively in the last year about methane production and oxidation pathways. So for the audience quickly, methanogenesis is a production of methane, and then you have a release into the water and atmosphere. And methane oxidation is a counteracting process by bacteria. So they basically eat up the methane that was produced. And normally all processes or all microbial processes tend to increase with increasing temperatures. That really has just something to do with the activity of bacteria. But it seems like that the methane production increases faster in summer than methane oxidation does. So you have more methane coming out overall. The balance is shifted towards a production.
So what you're saying now is actually getting us back to something that you highlighted, the knowledge gaps. And as we started this seminar, we mentioned Baltic Bridge, this new long-term collaboration between Helsinki University and Stockholm University. So what kind of knowledge gaps? What are we talking about? And how can one sort of start working with these knowledge gaps?
I think the major knowledge gaps are really linking different research fields. So far, it has always been the ecologists and biologists, geochemistry, atmospheric scientists doing their own work. taking their own topics in the coastal areas, or often not even the coast because they are so complicated. This new collaboration, Baltic Bridge 2.0 or Coast Clim, there are many names for it right now, but really aims to combine these research fields and get researchers together from different fields of atmospheric science, of geochemistry, the ecologists, have them sit together and think about how we can assess best these dynamics in the Baltic Sea. And I think this is really very special. This hasn't been done anywhere in the world yet.
Okay, great. And Camilla, your views
yes,
there?
I might add that previously, often when doing research in blue carbon ecosystems in general, it's very much what's been done is more looking at static variables such as carbon stock only, whereas more dynamic variables like these emissions of different greenhouse gases and fluxes have not necessarily been included so much. So we're trying to then put these different kinds of variables together and also expand this whole blue carbon concept. So we're not only focusing on these traditional blue carbon ecosystems, but we're trying to also, of course, look or explore other kinds of habitats, such as these coastal lagoons or even blue mussel reefs, for example. How do they influence carbon cycling?
So will there also be collaboration with scientists from the sort of economic, social sciences perspective? Because of course, in my head it pops up, all right, we know a lot about this. What about the policy aspects? Why aren't we taking good care of these systems? Why aren't they more a part of the climate debate? Is that also something that's becoming a part of this?
I think later on it will be, yes. First we need to start getting the whole research started, and then getting our first results, and then we will involve people also from the more social side of things and policymakers.
So if you are policymakers, you can decide, and it's going to happen tomorrow. This is my question that I ask all the researchers in the Baltic Breakfasts. What would you like to decide on? What is the key thing that needs to happen right now, even if there are knowledge gaps? What should we do now?
I think we need stricter regulations on what can be done in the coastal zones and what not. How much nutrients can be flushed in, or toxins, how good is our water treatment before it enters the Baltic Sea. I think these regulations need to be stricter enforced, and also we need to extend the areas of where we have protected sites along the Baltic Sea coastal area to keep these habitats healthy.
Okay, and this is interesting because at least from a Swedish perspective, we have an ongoing debate whether or not we have coastal protection or not. This is in Swedish strandskydd, so that's really on everybody's table right now. Camilla, what would you like to see?
I'm basically on the same page with Florian here. I definitely think that stricter regulations are in place for sure, and also increasing the protected areas. I don't remember the exact numbers of how much of the sea is protected in Finland, but it's compared to the terrestrial counterpart, it's not very large.
So both of you are asking for regulation. What about incentives? You can, of course, incentivize people or actors to do good things. Because you talked earlier about restoration and sort of trying to improve the environment.
Definitely. I think people that have a connection to the coast would like to do something for the sea as well, for the health of the sea. So incentives would also be a good way to reach out to people of making their efforts to help.
I think in that sense, awareness programs could really help as well. I know that many people here around Stockholm, they love the archipelago. They are out with their boats every weekend. They have houses in the archipelago. They may not be aware what is happening underwater. So that could be a good way to approach these people and raise awareness.
Thank you ever so much. We have actually a whole bunch of questions, but we will try to put all these questions and answers and your comments to the questions on our web. So to all of you who have been participating and listening, first a warm thanks to Florian and Camilla for excellent presentations, very interesting. And thanks to all of you who have been listening to this Baltic Breakfast. We are back on September 15th, and that'll be in Swedish, and we will talk about fishing and fish industry from an historic perspective, and looking in detail on herring as an example, but we have 2 guest presentations then also. So thanks for today, and welcome back later on in September. Thank you.